So, dear Professor Porten, dear Bezalel, I'm so happy that you're here at Heathrow Airport and that you have agreed to do this interview with me. As you know, we will publish the Elephantine papers presented last year at St. Andrews during the SPL conference. And I thought that it would be a nice idea to include together with the papers, to include an interview with you. So that is what we are going to do now, and I think we will have a long afternoon to go. I hope that the light will keep. So let's start, and I would like to start at the beginning. So first things first. Could you tell us a bit about your childhood?
I grew up in Philadelphia. I remember the address of the street. It was 2606 North 33rd Street. We lived in a 3-story building. We were on the first story, and I believe my grandparents were in the second. Then we rented out the third. And I went to a nice school, Walton School, which was nearby. And I remember the synagogue. It was a big synagogue across the street from the park, Fairmount Park, and we would play there. I remember the high holidays, while parents were davening, my friend and I would go out of the park. And then one day, I think it was 1938, I was born in 31, a tall man comes and they tell me this is Feta Avrum. He was my mother's brother, and he had come to visit us from Russia. And he looked at my mother and he said, it's a waste, you should get a job, you should work, you should get a store. And so they did, and we moved from 33rd Street to Germantown Avenue, where my mother opened a ladies' you call it Debbie's specialty shop, ladies' clothing store, and that was 3 stories also, and we lived above the store. My parents on the 2nd floor, my brother and I in the 3rd store, and I went to a whole new school, and I graduated there with an award that was called the American Legion Award at 8th grade for the best student. And it wasn't a well-to-do neighborhood. It was like kind of lower class aside from all the stores. And the high school in the neighborhood was Northeast High School. Of course, I wanted to go there. My mother said, no, you have to go to Central High, which was an academic school. And so I graduated 8th grade, and I went into newly built Central High. And it was just amazing, because it was a new building, and there was a clock in every room. And having been the brightest student of not very bright students, I came here, and everybody was a bright student. And I decided early on, under the influence of my cousin, when I read his, he had graduated from Central many years earlier, and I read his class yearbook. At the end of 4 years, he put out a book, and I said, oh, I was going to become the class historian. Mm-hmm. And so for 4 years, I took note of the important events of that year. And so when I, together with another student, wrote the class history, the school year is divided into semesters. And so this semester, what was taking place in the world around, and Central High, every class had a number, and we were number 190, 190th class to enter the school. The 190th class did this, or moved up to sophomore or junior and I became interested in history. My most interesting teacher was Disharoon, that was his name, and every class, graduating class, had a class sponsor, and he was our class sponsor, and he taught us Hamlet that year, and I felt like we knew the meaning of every word. So that get thee to a nunnery meant go to a house of prostitution. And we were standing out in front of the door one day, and he said to me, what was he going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to education school. School of education, he says. You don't go there. He says, you've got to get a liberal arts degree. And so I went to the head of the School of Education at Penn, and he said to me, well, if you want to be an engineer, where do you go? You want to be a doctor, where do you go? You want to be a teacher, where do you go? Okay. So I came back, and again we're standing in front of the door, and he says to me, where are you? I said, where are you going to go? School of Education. What? He said, you know, your School of Education, look down the hall, and pointed out to some teacher that we all made fun of, and he says, you can just take a course or two and become a teacher. And I hadn't dreamed of being a college teacher. So the bright boys went to Penn, and the not so bright boys went to Temple. And so I was going to go to Penn, but I got a scholarship to Temple. So that's where I went. And at the same time, I was going to Gratz College, which was an afternoon, an evening school. And there, my inspiration was Ellis Rifkin, who plied us with Marxism and the revolution betrayed, and we became closet Marxists. And then he went off to the Hebrew Union College, and the Korean War broke out, and I had to make a basic decision. I had been in ROTC, not the Royal, but Reserve, I forgot what it was, but you were Officer Training Corps, and you prepared yourself for enlistment in the Army. And the first 2 years were for nothing, but when you went for the third year, you had to sign up for the Army. And our ROTC unit was a transportation corps. So this was June when the Korean War broke out, and I had to decide, was I going to go into third year ROTC, or my mother had always wanted to be a rabbi, and so okay, I'll enroll in the pre-Theo program at the Jewish Theological Seminary, conservative movement. And at the same time, when I graduated first in my class. I studied Jewish history with Selo Baroon. And at the seminary, I had a magnificent teacher who was Shalom Spiegel. He was the brother of the movie producer Sam Spiegel. And I always had dreamed of a Spiegel Brothers production of Jeremiah. And so he inspired me to go into Bible. I wasn't excited by Baroon. I think Ellis Rifkin had turned me off. So I took a semester, and that year was Tzvi Ankori, who was Baroon's prize student, and became a leading scholar. And I switched into American history, and I wrote my master's on the United States and Chiang Kai-shek. And then I had to decide where was I going to go, because if I continued with China, I had to learn Chinese. And my mother didn't want me to study Russian. She was afraid that McCarthy would get me or something. So I figured I would take advantage of what I had, and I would go back to Jewish history. Well, Baron did 18 volumes of Jewish history, but there's only half a volume on the biblical period. There's nothing more to write. It's all there. So I asked him, and I asked H.L. Ginsberg, who was my Bible teacher after Spiegel, and H.L. says, well, I'm interested in Ben Sira. He had something, that wouldn't fly with Baron. And Baron said, well, look, the Brooklyn Museum just acquired and published new Aramaic papyri.
Voila.
So here is new material, room for new treatment. And so that's how I got into Elephantine. And I remember my first seminar report was on the marriage contracts, and I had these little 3x5 cards that we all had, and I began reading from the cards, and Baron says, Mr. Porten, put away your cards and tell your story. So fortunately, I had learned the material, and I could tell my story. And then when I graduated the seminary and presented my first paper to him, it was the names at Elephantine. And I was very proud of it, 30 pages, and gave it back to me, not a single comment on it. But he wrote, this is philology, not history. And so I realized that I was following H.L. and not writing history.
Yeah.
And I had to learn how to write history. I had studied history at Temple, and we had everything, Chinese history and the French Revolution and British and whatnot, but I didn't know that history is written from sources.
And that you need to learn to read the
sources.
sources.
Yeah, you need to learn, you read the sources. And Baron told me that, not everybody can write history. And he says, look at Marx, Margolis and Marx. That was a dry as dust book. And so I graduated the seminary in 57, at the same time finished my coursework at Columbia, and all I had to do was to write the dissertation, but I never sent him one more work. And what he taught me was, tell your story. You look at his book, 18 volumes, and every page is clean, but the notes are all in the back. Yeah. And every footnote is a mile high. Yeah. It's a discursus. And that's what I learned to do when I wrote my dissertation, and I wrote the book afterwards, is not to be argumentative in the body of the text. And any argument should go into the footnote. My greatest pride was when I gave the book that ultimately came out to my mother. She says, oh, I can understand this. Huh?
Yeah. So actually it was an early vocation in your life to enter history, Jewish history, perhaps a bit later, but you knew it already as a small boy. You never dreamt of becoming a dinosaur or...
no, also never dreamt of writing with Elephantine.
Oh, writing
and never dreamt of Jewish history. It was history.
Yeah.
But here I'd accumulated this...
Yeah.
Knowledge.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And what attracted you most in this field was the fact that it was a new field. You said, well, they were just discovered, just published, the Brooklyn Aramaic papyri. So that was what attracted you most, this blank field.
Well, Baron told me it should be a social history, not religious, because Van Sant had done, in the late 30s, a 700-page book on the religion of the Jews of Elephantine. And I had accumulated, in the course of the study, a lot of material, but I didn't put it in the book. And when I finished the book, or how did the thesis turn into a book? I was teaching at the University of California in Berkeley, and so I submitted it to their press. And they sent it to readers, and one reader said, well, this is very nice, but if he wants to go as a monograph, then he can go as is. But if he wants it to be a book, there should be a chapter on religion.
Yeah.
So I consulted with Moshe Greenberg, who was a friend, and he said, no, do what I did with my Chabiru, just as is. And then I consulted with somebody at the University of California. I was then at Davis, and he said, what's a book about Jews without a chapter on religion? And so I found I had 2 chapters, and I did 2 chapters on religion, the Jews.
Yeah.
And what later Mark Geller in London told me, he was just amazed how I covered so many different fields. I mean, I just wanted everything. They asked me, what's your thesis? I said, my thesis, it's a history of the whole community, you know.
Yeah.
Food, clothing, and housing. And Barone said you could do that anywhere, Japan. I mean, but that's what I did. And when I finished, I said, well, I shouldn't stop here. I should have Grayling, and you have this little book, Cowley, which has been the standard collection of texts from 1920s up till the time of Grayling. I said, like Cherry Cover's Corpus Papyrorum Musicarum, there should be a Corpus Papyrorum Americarum.
Yeah.
And that'll replace all of these others.
Yeah.
And
when did you move to Israel? Was this because of your work? Was this for personal motives or a combination of both?
No, this was out of my Jewish education, the Zionism. I thought that here, after 2,000 years of yearning for Zion, there it is, and Jews can go there, so that's where it is, and why should I sit here? And when I told Debbie, I said, we want to go. She said, that wasn't part of the deal.
Yeah.
But she came along and got an invitation to Haifa. I had met people there during an earlier sabbatical. I was very fortunate. I met Reuven Yaron, who had written on the law of Elephantine, and he was very supportive. And there were all these young scholars, a little older than I was, but still young, Malamat and Todd Moore, and they were supportive, and we came to Haifa and then spent a year there, and we had to go back, but my boy had this disease that needed to be operated on there in Israel, and so we couldn't go back right away. And Debbie said, well, if you want to stay here for another year, I want to live in Jerusalem. So we moved to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
One thing led to another.
Yeah.
But to write this corpus, I thought I should see a papyrus, which I'd never seen one.
Then you started to travel.
And then I started to travel, and the first thing is what's right in your backyard, which is the Brooklyn Museum.
Yeah.
And we went to Camp Ramah every summer in Wisconsin. And at the end of the summer, I went to the Brooklyn Museum. And there was a curator, a lovely fella, by the name of Ken Linsner. And he's showing me these papyri. And here's a photograph that was taken by Bruce Zipperman, who is a document photographer, and he photographed lots of things which he's put on his blog. Inscriptifact.
Facts, yeah.
Inscriptifact, right. Now, Kraling, who published these, published the whole papyrus, but on the back of the papyrus, when you rolled it up, was a one-line endorsement that told you what was inside in a single sentence. These one-line endorsements he just published separately on a single page, one line. And what he published for this papyrus is this line up here. And whereas every papyrus had an endorsement which says, Sefer, document of such and such, which so-and-so wrote for so-and-so, this one had a whole sentence. Hanelet Talmud le'anani biyada ksaf kar shchad shiklin chamsa. The Talmud brought into her hand to Anani. Talmud was the woman, and Anani was the man. Silver, 1 karsh, 5 shekel. And this seemed to contradict what it said inside the text, because inside the text she brings in about half of that amount. So which one is correct? And every scholar tried to explain it one way or another. And so when I came there and we're looking at these, and they're all englazed between two pieces of glass. So the curator who was showing me around asked me, what's this writing down here? And I said, what writing? Nobody noticed any writing. And he said, well, look at it. And so I looked at it, and I discovered that at this edge are the last 2 letters of the word Sefer, document. And that right after that at the break is the letter Aleph, so it's Sefered into the document of wifehood. And then over here, you would have the 2 letters for Tamat, which Anani wrote for Tamat. And I said, oh my goodness, why didn't Kraling see this?
Yeah.
Well, because he wasn't looking. And why wasn't he looking? Because he didn't have a concept of where the endorsement should be on the verso in relation to the text on the recto. So it turns out that what you have to do when you have this thing here, when you turn it upside down, your endorsement is going to be on the bottom. So this was an addition because there was no room here. So this instituted for me a whole discipline, the anatomy of a papyrus.
Yeah. That was a crucial moment for
right,
you. Yeah,
that was a crucial moment.
Yeah. So you started to travel and you examined all these papyri and from this specific angle. At some point you will have visited Elephantine. When was it? When was the first time that you?
When Sadaq came to Jerusalem, I had a student, Dan Margalit. Don Margalit, become a prominent commentator, reporter, was in my class, and he said they were having talks in Jerusalem at the time, and he was going to introduce me to one of the delegates of that talk. And the afternoon he called me and he says, so that broke off the negotiations. Don't come. And so what am I going to do? He said, well, do you have any contact in the States? Well, I went to Gratz College, and they said, well, if you can get a letter from them. So in their stationery, we wrote to this little woman, I forget her name, who was head of all the museums and the head of that museum, and asking if I could come and would they have a flashlight examine it, could I measure, and she sends me back a handwritten letter and says, you're welcome, you're welcome. And so I came. I was the first Israeli with an American passport to come to Egypt, and I spent almost a month in the Egyptian Museum.
Oh, yeah.
Interviewed, and they said, "What are you looking for? What are you looking for? What do you want to find?" I'm looking. I'm looking. And the last week was the Bayram, which is a feast where those who can't go to Mecca celebrate at home. And so there was no work in the museum, so I went down to Elephantine.
Yeah, yeah. And how was this for you as an observant Jew to visit one of the first Jewish communities in the diaspora?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't look upon it as a Jewish community in the diaspora.
You didn't realize it at the moment?
No, I mean, it was, for me, it was like Mari or Nuzi or Garit.
Yeah.
It was an ancient community that happened to be populated by Jews, Jewish military colony. But I'll tell you, you know, this book came out by Simon Shama, The Story of the Jews, right? His first chapter is on Elephantine.
Yeah. And
he was wise enough to consult me, and I corrected one of his egregious errors because he followed Dulu Sayada Yad with the wrong chronology, and I corrected him on that, and he thanks me in a footnote for saving him such an egregious error. And he made me realize that Elephantine is not just Nuzi, Mari, but it's the beginning of Jewish history.
Yeah, that is when you start to realize that it is really very special. Yeah. So, and did you ever go back there?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
We went back several times. I went with Adi Ardeni, and we copied the papyri in the museum. And we did a trip down to Elephantine, and we stopped at not Asyut, but Abydos.
Yes.
And we copied all the stuff in the walls.
The graffiti.
Yeah. See, they were on and off. There was a moment where they said, I remember the director saying, "Aren't there any papyri in Jerusalem?" They're not the same, And he introduced me, "Do you know Professor Porten?" He said, "Oh, who doesn't know Professor Porten?" But, so that was that off period. And then, what's his name, became the director, the fellow who was a demotic scholar at the university. And he was very kind, and he wrote everything permit. We could do the Abydos and copy this stuff in Elephantine. And then when Van Plumber made his discovery, and this was a real moment, the first article that I had written in my career, the first paper that I gave, was a plan of the Jewish district in Elephantine, because you had a temple there, and surrounding it were houses that are described in the contracts. And these are either above or below or east or west of the temple. And so one could draw up a map. And Kraling had a map, and I looked at it, and I said, "No, it's not right." Yeah. And so I revised it.
Different orientation.
Different orientation. Yeah. And I gave that as my first paper. And I remember Ann Kilmer was there. She was also a young scholar at Berkeley, and got very nice comments, you know, short but very nice. And that was it. And I didn't think about it until one day, turns out 37 years later, I get this paper by this guy I'd never heard of, Cornelius van Pilgrim, in a Festschrift. And I looked through it, oh, he's got my drawing there. What's it doing? And then another more page, and I see he's got the drawing of the archaeological site there. And what he's done is imposed the drawing of the archaeological site upon my drawing, and says that essentially my drawing is what they've discovered.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
yeah. A wonderful confirmation of what you have discovered.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I was very impressed by the lecture by Cornelius. Yeah, it was wonderful.
So I ran down there, and before I went to Elephantine, I first went to him and spoke about his article at great length, and then I went down there and we looked and everything. And,
Yeah, it must have been a wonderful
That
experience.
was wonderful.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. So, if we take a look at your career, when you look back, what would you call your most important achievement?
Well, the most important achievement, I would say, as far as Elephantine is concerned, is having monopolized the market. In other words, anybody that cites anything about Elephantine has to now, and does, cite it from our 4 volumes. Textbook of Aramaic documents of ancient Egypt.
Yeah, so the corpus, the textbooks.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is TAD.
Yeah.
And I, way back when I first began this project, I thought it would take a year or so. And I got an NEH, National Endowment of Humanities, America grant to do this. And then I met Ada Yardeni, and this was a whole new dimension, because, I began to read the texts, but she was an artist and a paleographer, and she copied the texts. So you have an example there, right?
Yeah. This is her drawing.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a full-size drawing.
Yeah.
You can see this is, and here you can see it turned around, right? And here you can see, so here you filled in, you see Sfar Itai Zi Kitav Anani Litamat. So here's the top, and there's the elephant. Sam Pei Reish.
Yeah.
So,
what is the secret of this cooperation? Because it is a long-term cooperation.
Well, we had a goal, and when I began, I didn't think we were going to do ostraca. I just thought of papyri. But ostraca are kept by museums and institutions in their papyrus collection, so it's part of papyrus. So it was another mountain to climb.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just so magnificent. One of the pieces that had been published by Zachau was Achikar, the wisdom of Achikar. And papyri are created in individual sheets, and they're not stored as a ream of paper is stored, but they're made into a scroll, a Megillah, which is 20 sheets, or could be longer, and Egyptian papyri are usually found in scrolls. But a keycard was found in individual sheets. And so the question was, this is like Proverbs. What's the connection between one chapter and the next? They're individual Proverbs. Or Psalms, individual Psalms. And the excavator had given the individual sheets letters, A through K, L, but the publisher, Zachau, took some of the sheets and reversed the letters. He thought that the sheets had to be different. So, when we came to publishing Achikar, we had this question, and how to lie with statistics. We had developed this whole method of each sheet, how wide is it, and then between the sheets, and so you could imagine if you followed Zachau's order, that it would fit the order of a scroll, the sheets in the scroll side by side. And I just said, well, look, this is a palimpsest. It had been written previously, and you could see shades remains of the writing on the photos, which were very good. And she said, if we could read the palimpsest, maybe this would be a clue to the order of the sheets. I said, yeah, well, okay.
Let's give it a try.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the, so it was just at this time that the wall came down, which was, I guess, 89. They were celebrating it now. And somebody told me that you should take prints, special prints. And somebody said, well, the Berlin police station should be able to do that for you. So here was Ingeborg Miller, who had followed her husband as curator, and this is in East Berlin, and the wall went down, and I could reveal my identity. We came from Israel, sort of, and we got into a cab, and she took this pile of some 10 glass frames of Achikar papyri, and we went across town to the Berlin police station, and they, on their after hours, took little Polaroid photos. Here, 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 here. And we worked on them for a year. And then we came back, and who happened to be there but Bruce Zuckerman, who was the document photographer at SUSC, who did these photographs. And he was photographing some other stuff. And I said, well, look, do our stuff. He says, sure. And so he took infrared photos, and he gave us all of his infrared photos of these things. And that was just magnificent. So we discovered that what we had here was a customs account, month by month, according to the Egyptian calendar. And so we could now take these pieces. Ada was able to decipher it almost wholly, and there was a lot of repeats, and so formulaic language, you got used to what the words were. We didn't know the meaning of every word, but it was an account of ships coming into and going out from Egypt every month, and what were the goods that they brought with them. And so we had month by month. And
we have it here,
you can show that. And so we gave a new arrangement to the keycard wisdom. And this customs account became very important.
You want to show it? It's not a drawing, but yeah, there we have the small.
You can see here is an example of putting this together, front and back, and where you see little writing, that's the text, and these are the missing fragments, and we had to figure out how they fit in. Here,
Yeah.
for example, is the beginning. So here you can see how we filled in the spaces, and each one has this whole scroll and the arrow pointing to where we are. And we go on and on. We have translation in Hebrew and English. So here's the next one. You see the little here we've restored all of this on the basis of what we imagine to be.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece of work.
Yeah.
I've seen Ada at work. I visited her at home.
Yeah.
She was working on this text.
Working
Yeah.
on the customs account.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
Here we begin to, these are the fragments of a keycard. This wisdom. And that's based on the order and is based on the customs account. So this was extremely exciting.
Yeah,
And
a great
finished,
achievement.
when we finished that, we said, well, they're Ostrika. And so we had Ostrika, we went back to Cairo and Berlin, and there was this Clermont-Ganneau collection the French had discovered and hadn't been published.
Yeah.
But Dupont-Sommer published about 10 pieces, and Schnitzer was in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Modrzejewski, Melej,
Yeah.
was in Jerusalem at the time, and I said to him, pardon the ethnic, I said, here's one pole to the other. I said, you talk.
Yeah.
And let us publish those that have been published.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we did 10 pieces from that collection.
Yeah. So.
And then there were 2 in Moscow.
Yeah.
That had been in the Golenishev collection. And so we got to Moscow.
Are you dissatisfied with any of your achievements, or perhaps less satisfied? Or is it a difficult question?
No, you always say, would you do it again, or what could you do better? I had one disappointment, but in the course of things, it doesn't matter. When I was first in Cairo, the expression, you got to strike while the iron is hot.
Yeah.
Don't do the day what you can put off to tomorrow, but don't put off for tomorrow what you can do today, and do it now because you don't know what tomorrow will bring.
Yeah.
So there was a collection, the Hermopolis papyri, that were housed in the University of Cairo, I believe it was. And my first visit, when you're welcome, you're welcome. So I got to see them. And there was a reporter who was there, and because I was hot stuff, and they interviewed me, and we were there, and he was going to take pictures, and I said, no, we'll have I should have said, go ahead, take him, take him, take him. Because later, didn't let me take him.
Yeah.
Didn't let me take him.
Yeah.
And in our book, we don't have her drawings. We don't have her drawings and photos. We took the photos that Bresciani made, and we played with them. And then in the museum at Cairo, there was Bülow Jakobsen, who was doing photographing for UNESCO, the Greek papyri. And I got him to piggyback my stuff in infrared. And I was there on leave, on research from the university, and I was still a young scholar, and I had to get back to teach, and I was afraid if I came back late, they'd be all very angry. But the job wasn't finished, and I figured once I left, he'd continue. But once I left, Hafif wouldn't let him continue. So I lost out on the rest of the infrareds for.
Yeah.
So
that's unfortunate.
Yeah. But in the long scheme of things, those are, I guess.
Yeah. About the legal formulary, I would like to ask you something. We have seen several positions in the past. Quite often scholars will have a look at the Akkadian sources. In recent years, we see several attempts to compare it with the demotic legal formulary. What is your position in this?
Well, when I wrote my book, I took a sample or a default Aramaic contract and a default demotic contract, translated the clauses into English, and compared the marriage documents and the conveyances, and found that the conveyances, Aramaic and demotic, were very similar, in the Aramaic, and the marriage less so. And so, and that was back in 1964. And I concluded that one could write in one language or the other, and each one would understand the other. Now my good friend and classmate was Yochanan Mufs, who wrote about the term Tivli Vavi, which he traced back to Sumerian, and said that the origin of a legal formulary at Elephantine is in Neo-Assyrian documents. Now, Bonta came to me from Argentina, and he wanted a tutorial in translating the Aramaic documents. And we met once a week, and we were supposed to do like a document a session, and then he became more and more involved with details and wanted to know this and that, and so we began to do more and more about less and less, and then he said he wanted to do a doctorate. And I said, well, you got to learn Egyptian. And I said, oh, you should go to my friend in Würzburg. And so he went off, and he studied 2 years, not only demotic, but other phases of Egyptian, and he studied some cuneiform, Akkadian, and of course Coptic. And he came back. I wasn't certain that he would finish, but he did. Came out with cum laude. And I gave a paper at the demotic conference. I took about 30 formulae that are parallel in Aramaic and Egyptian, and I raised the question, who is the borrower and who is the lender? And then Ridner wrote a paper afterwards, and he said Aramaic is the borrower, Egyptian is the lender. And this is what Botha has said. So, independent of Muff Steady, when I compared these two sets of documents, one of my big delights, I had prepared to do a volume of Elephantine papyri, and so I had all the demotic documents, and I went every year after camp for about 2 weeks in Chicago, and I met with George Hughes, and we translated the demotic documents. And one day it says to me, you know, this is very funny. And he reads to me the demotic, and I say, George, that sounds like Aramaic. And so he and Fleming, I mean, was at the same time, came to the conclusion that this particular demotic document from Elephantine was a translation of an Aramaic. In other words, however you describe it, the scribe, the bureaucrat that was writing demotic was writing Aramaic. And of course the Amherst papyrus, which is Aramaic but in a demotic script, shows that these two are interchangeable. So I think Botha is onto something.
Yeah.
You asked me another question. Let me anticipate. Why haven't they found any Hebrew documents?
Yeah. So that's I think that is an important issue, indeed. So among all these documents found at Elephantine or Elephantine, there are no Hebrew documents. So what is your idea?
Well, first of all, I created the concept archives from Elephantine, and two were obvious, and then I put together the Yadunya archive, and so now they speak about that, and it probably included a keycard and the Byzantine text, but if you would go to an army base, an American army base, and you would go into the home of a soldier, an officer, what documents would you find there? Would you find military documents? And if he's a secularist, then you might not find any Bibles there. So all this is chancy, you know. The absence of evidence is not evidence of the absence of, you know, is not evidence for absence.
No, that's absolutely true, of course.
But
I would have expected at least something.
But the question is, did they know Hebrew?
That's a good question.
Okay.
But that might be a conclusion from...
Okay. Now I'm going to tell you one of my neat discoveries, because I dealt with names. I told you the first paper that I wrote for Barone, and I did the article for the Encyclopedia Migraid on names, and I have a whole section of my book on names. A name is a prayer, and Not wrote this wonderful little book on Israelische Personennomen, right? And you have Dankname and Wunschname, and the perfect and the imperfect, and the imperfect is future. It's not like they want to say the same thing as the perfect. Now, you take the Hermopolis papyri. These are all by non-Jews. Mm-hmm. There's barely a Hebrew name there. Yeah. And you see that they are a mix. They are a mix of Egyptian names and Aramean names, Aramaic names. You take the witness lists in all the Aramaic contracts, you can say 30 contracts. There are 4 witnesses, father and son, 8 witnesses. almost all, virtually, are Hebrew names.
Yes.
Hebrew names. There's not a mix there. There's not a Hebrew son of Egyptian, Egyptian son of Hebrew, one or two. Now, Miftachia, the hero of one of our archives, is the daughter of Machseah. Now you take Psalm 91. Tov lachsot badanai miptoch benedivim. Lachsot Machseah. Toch Miftachia. So where did this idea that if your name is Machseah, you should give your daughter the name Miftachia?
Yeah.
Because Miftachia, and in Lachish, we've got a Lachish Ostrakan, is a male name, masculine name. So there's some Hebrew in there, and it occurs in a psalm in Hallel as well, that has a Hebrew consciousness. They kept their Hebrew names. So is it all artificial? You asked my wish list. I would love to see some Hebrew papyrus found there. Obviously, their daily language is Elephantine, is Aramaic, because all the Ostrika.
Yeah.
And these are wishes, you know. Hello, Mom, send me some salt, and send me this, and when are you going to do the Passover? And it's not in Hebrew, it's all...
Yeah. So what will be on your wish list?
Well, I say to find some more papyri at Aswan, where Cornelius is digging.
Yeah.
To find an archive at Aswan.
Yeah, and what kind of an archive?
A family archive.
Yeah.
Any kind of archive, but at least a family archive.
Yeah, a family archive with a Jewish or
no
background,
Aramean
background, yeah,
which would confirm.
That's what you expect there.
Yeah.
Let's go to another topic, and that is the discussion which is going on unprovenanced materials. Your latest publication in cooperation with Ada Yardeni, is the publication of some 400 ostraka from Idemia. And as you know, there is a discussion going on among scholars about the way we should deal with unprovenance materials. Some scholars will heavily disagree with the publication of these texts, while others will say, texts like these should be made available to the scholarly world. So I would like to hear your opinion on this.
Well, I think it was Larry Schiffman said, what are we supposed to do? Put them back in the ground? They're out there. Now, auction off pieces of art for tremendous amounts, and once some Japanese buyer or whoever buys it, what does he do with it? He doesn't usually give it to a museum for public display. He keeps it in his house, and it's lost to the world. So, take these ostrika. There are 2,000 of them. And they were either found at El Qom, supposedly. Makeda is mentioned in 100 of these pieces. And Dorsey determined that this is El Qom, and Anson Rainey supported that idea. Or, recently it turns out that one of the pieces that was found at Mareshah, El Qom is in the area of Hebron, and Mareshah is more down in the Shfela. One of those pieces turns out to belong to a list of documents from my collection. So, do these ostrika come from El Qom, or do they come from Mareshah? Now, Mareshah is mostly a Second Temple site, but there's Persian period stuff there. And the excavations are taking place all underground, because that's where the big mounds are, and they're not stratified mounds, but they're dumps. And so they have, and there are like cave sites, these dumps, and there are numerous sites. And one site has turned up 350 Greek ostraka in this big dump. Not stratified, but over the years they've come up with this. And 40 Aramaic pieces here and 20 pieces here. And S.T. Eshel's been publishing these. Now I went to Mare Shah recently, and with Ian Stern, who's in charge of the excavation there, and I posed a question to him. I said, look, you guys worked for how many years, and with effort you came up with some 40 or even 350, but not all at once. And here are 2,000 pieces. Why didn't you find these? How come the Arabs were better than you, that they found all of these? Where did they find them if they came from Mare Shah? Now, after 67 and 68, Deaver and company went into El Com. They dug there, and they came up with about a dozen pieces. Not from this period, from a later period. And why didn't they find these? So the Arabs, and my brother is a tour guide, my boy is a tour guide, Gabriel, and I told him this story, and he says, oh, I smell this stuff. And I had a talk the other day with Shmulek Achituv, epigrapher and editor of IEJ, and he told me, he says, he went in 68 with a group to El Com, and there, he says, is standing there, and there's a kid that comes up, and he's selling antiquity. He's selling this stuff. Now, here's a story, you can believe it or not, but it's a story. When I met Garrity, who published the El Com stuff, I told him, I said, you know, we're in touch with Baidoon, who has been selling this stuff, and he had some 9 left, and so we made him a deal. We said, look, there's the Musaif collection and the Yessasan collection and the Foyer collection. We'd like to have the Baidoon collection. So if you would let us have your pieces, then we would publish them in, you know, the Baidoon collection. Oh, he was amenable. And we had seen all of these. We didn't know where they were, but we had the photos of all of these but one. And so now the IAJ will be publishing his stuff. And Garrity said, ask him to take you to El Com and ask around there. So we asked, and I had this wonderful assistant who's now in London, Matt Kletzing, and he was doing a master's there, and he lived for a period in the old city, so he knew his way around. So he would go to Baidoon, and Baidoon would always say to, well, you know, Bukra, mañana. And then one time he called in an Arab from down the street, and from El Com, he said. And this Arab tells him, he said, he remembers as a child standing there, and they would bring this stuff out of the ground, and there was somebody who was, you know, collecting them and paying him or whatever. Well, if that story is true, then the only person could have been Lenny Wolf, because where did Efal and Naved get their stuff? From Lenny Wolf. They didn't see a papyrus. They didn't see an ostraka. And the Egyptian Museum got the stuff as a gift from Bob Foyer, who's the friend of my friend in Woodmere, New York. And I seem to remember, if my memory doesn't deceive me, that I saw a whole collection of ostrich that Lenny Wolf had, for which he wanted $25,000. Maybe my memory is playing tricks on me, and I felt I could never raise that money, so I was not yet into the ostrich. I say, if the archaeologists didn't find anything at El Qom, and they didn't find anything, or not much, at Mare Shah, then we should be grateful to these Arabs who dug it out of the ground, brought it to dealers, sold it to collectors, who put it at the disposal of scholars, so that we could enhance our understanding of the Persian period, which has virtually no literary texts. And in this collection of these 2,000 pieces, there are about 10 categories. Some are known from other sources, lists of names, accounts, all these commodity chits, but there's a whole group which are workers' texts. It starts out with a date, a month, a day and a month. First Kislev, Beit Balrim, Koschanan, Poel Echad. And there are about 70 of these by the same scribe, and the 5 major clans. Each clan has to supply a worker for a particular day, and this is a whole picture into corvée. Poel is not a urban worker, he's a agricultural laborer doing agricultural work. So this is a whole new area.
Yeah, yeah.
And to say nothing of the onomastics, there are so many new names. So these things should definitely be.
Yeah. It would be a loss if it would
Be
not
be
published.
a major loss.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would like to ask you, we have a new generation of scholars to come, and I would like to ask you what would be a good advice to these young students in our field. How should they be equipped to achieve what you have achieved? And how can they pursue their goals?
Well, first of all, you have to have persistence. You have to be ready to deal with what my mother would call the kleine eshelach, ha'otiyot haktanot. You have to have, when I was in school, the book with Werner Keller, The Bible is History, and that excited us. And when I graduated in 1957, Albright retired from Johns Hopkins, and he came on sabbatical to the seminary, and I met him, I remember, in the basement there, and he spoke, and I said, you know, I'm interested in archaeology. I said, what is it to be an archaeologist? He says, you have to have an eye for form. I didn't understand the answer, so I thought I'd never be an archaeologist. Now, many years later, I was with Kyle McCarter in the ceremony at Qumran, and I told him the story. And he says, yeah, and he says, Frank Cross, when he taught epigraphy, would tell his students that what you need is an eye for form. And so a student ran out to the bookstore and asked for an eye for form. So one is, and that's what I called my paper, an eye for form, that I gave at the conference. So one is persistence and a love of detail and an assumption that you have to see the forest for the trees, but you can't see the forest unless you can see the trees. Now, I hadn't set out to be a Near Eastern scholar, so I never learned Semitic languages like my colleagues and friends did. When I got to Chicago, I said, well, what I got to learn is Egyptian. So I did with John Wilson a year, and then I think I was self-taught in demotic and did a couple studies in demotic. I feel very hampered today when I'm working with the Idumean names that I don't know Arabic. So a student today, depending upon where he's from, if he wants to go into ancient Near Eastern studies, he should have when I recommend or draw recommendations for Bota, I say that he is unique, that he knows both Egyptian and Akkadian. He's able to control them both. And you don't find many...
That is rather unique.
You don't find many people like that. And I have to ask him if he knows Arabic. I don't know if he knows Arabic. But I would say either and or Egyptian and Akkadian. Of course, the question is what field of Akkadian. I asked Wayne Horowitz a question. He said, "Oh, it's Neo-Babylonian." He said, "I'm only in Neo-Assyrian." He said, "You asked Laurie for that." And Arabic, because I think it gives you a sense of linguistics. So when you look at a word, I mean, we have these names, and either we'll try to explain some of the basis of Arabic, and I say, well, the root, there was a period where a lot of Arabic explanations were given to Hebrew words. I say, it may sound like Arabic, but does this word occur in an Arabic name? So you got to have a sense of not just the language, but somehow the literature. So it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But what, you're going to climb Mount Everest, how high do you want to go? You want to go just to this level? I mean, you want to go higher, so you got to read more deeply, and you got to learn more, and you got to start out at a young age. And I don't know how many kids know what they want to do that early.
Yeah. Can you tell us a nice anecdote?
Yeah, I was at the Paris airport, and there's a fellow who's working on his suitcase there, and he looks at me and he says, "Aren't you Mr. Elephantine?" I said, "Okay." He says, "And what's your name?" I said, "Well, Mr. Elephantine, you forgot my name, so I identify." And he is, turns out to be, he was Alon Goshen Gutstein, the son of the famous linguist.
Yeah.
And many years later, at a conference in Boston, I meet Alon at a restaurant. He's attending the conference, as I was. And I say, "Alon," I says, "you remember," I said, "way back at the Paris airport, you met and you called me Mr. Elephantine?"
You didn't remember?
He didn't remember.
Oh.
So
Yeah.
Sharon, when he became prime minister and contradicted what he had said earlier, he said, "What you see from here, you didn't see from there." So an incident that is of seminal importance to you was just a passing event to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's life.
That's life.
Yeah, it's life.
Right.